Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode.
Welcome to the podcast. Today we've got a very cheerful subject. We're going to be talking about guilt. This was a request from one of our listeners, and I think it's one that is pervasive throughout all of this struggle. I've got a lot of thoughts around guilt. I'm sure you do as well, Steph, but maybe we start with what we're talking about when we talk about guilt, or we could have a little preamble and see how each other is. Which would you prefer, option A or option B?
Oh, preamble. Yeah.
Well, it's always a bit strange, I think, answering how I am, because people hear this 5 weeks later. So I might say how I am now, and that's not how I am when it's released. I don't know why that's relevant. Something big might happen between now and then it's redundant how I was 5 weeks ago.
I care now.
Okay. I'm good. I'm cozy here in my electric blanket. It's cold and dull here in the UK. I spent Christmas in the sunshine, so it's a bit of a shock to come back to winter here. That's me. How are you?
I'm okay. I had a rough December. I don't hide these. I wrote about it in my weekly email. I had a rough time burning out a little bit. So I am taking some time to set more boundaries with my self-expectations. And so navigating that it feels good at the same time as it feels, it's scaring me a bit. So I'm a bit up and down, I think. Mm-hmm. I always feel good doing this, to be honest. I feel really calm in my closet. So that's where I'm at.
How do you decide what to share with your email list? Because it sounds like that could be pretty cathartic for you and potentially helpful for other people. Mm-hmm. And on the other side of it, it could also
be vulnerable.
Yeah, vulnerable. And also like, well, this is cheaper than therapy. I'm just going to write to on my email list. And
I literally, if you haven't been able to tell by now, I'm not much of a planner. So I literally sit down to write at the allotted time that I've built into my week to write my emails, and I start writing. I don't necessarily always know what it's going to be about, although sometimes I have a hunch, but I don't know what's going to come out. So yesterday I sat down at my kitchen table and I just started writing, and I knew I was going to write about something about the way I've been feeling, and it came out, and it just came out, and I sent it. And I always have a bit of a vulnerability hangover afterwards, but to me, it's the most authentic way that I am. Mm-hmm. It's always been my way of processing and of relating to others. I think for me, it's about feeling less alone and having other people feel less alone too. And this shared experience, whole thing.
Yeah. And to me, that's exactly what we're doing here with the podcast as well. Do you ever feel worried though that you pour your heart out and then you look and you see like 10 people unsubscribed?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And that has become okay with me. Mm-hmm. So it used to really shatter me. And now I'm like, cool, I'm just honing in on my audience.
So speaking of vulnerability, let's talk about guilt. That was a really clumsy segue, but I'm going to go with it anyway. Where does guilt feature? Like when we talk about food, it's everywhere. And I certainly got lots of tales I can tell about my own experience of guilt. But I suppose because we're talking about how we are now, where does guilt show up for you now?
Motherhood. I find with my family, it will show up because of family dynamics that still exist that I haven't quite worked through enough, I feel like. So sometimes with interactions with my family, if I say something from an impulsive place, or if somebody says something to me from their impulsive place, I will feel guilt about who I am or how I say things. I think I feel shame more than I feel guilt.
I think for me, the two are almost inextricably linked. I get that there is technically a difference. Guilt is supposed to be this idea of feeling bad about something that you've done something wrong, and shame tends to be tied in with the belief that you're what's wrong, you're the problem, you're defective in some way. But I think for me that guilt almost always comes with shame, because if I've done something wrong, I can have that feeling of being a bad person, which is the whole shame part. So for me, they are such close bedfellows, even if they're not quite the same. I'm trying to think when I might have experienced guilt with no shame, maybe about smaller things that are less important to me.
Or like generally mistakes, things that are like, I know I did that thing, but I don't, it doesn't mean anything about me. Like there's a separation there. That's to me, I don't know that I have that much guilt by itself. Like, I don't think that really necessarily does exist too much. Where do you feel it?
I think I feel guilt the most linked with the shame when I believe I should have been able to have been better, done something differently. Like you said, when you make a mistake, and sometimes if you don't know, you don't have all the information, or you make a mistake or you make a slip, it's much easier to tolerate that. But if I do something or I don't do something, say something, think something, feel something, and I believe that I should be able to not feel, think, do, say that thing, that I think for me is when I feel shame. So in order to reduce it, what really had to happen for me was reducing, it comes back to these unrealistic expectations that I think we've touched on before in the podcast. So when I started having a bit more compassion for myself around the food stuff, even though perhaps my behavior around food and my food choices hadn't changed that much, that was when the shame started to reduce, and the guilt started to reduce as part of that, because as I said, the two are tightly linked.
Well, also, I think shame taps in when you know there is some truth to something that maybe you haven't, for me anyway, like when I'm thinking about feeling that shame, it's always goes back to there is something here I haven't quite looked at enough, or I know that there's room for, I don't want to say improvement, but there's room for introspection that I perhaps maybe even feel compelled or called to do. And it's like an invitation for that a lot of times. And I think that's how I generally try to move through it, is by saying, like, what is really underneath this that's my own insecurity that I'm actually looking to explore a little bit more. And then that helps me through it, because I'm like, okay, how can I take this insecurity and look at it? And then how am I going to address that rather than ignore it? Because I think when I ignore something that I feel insecure about or shame about, then it just festers, rather than me saying, all right, I'm going to pull this up and look at it. And what can I do about it? Does this belong here or not?
When I was thinking before this episode and just trying to remember an actual occasion where the guilt felt really strong, it was very much a shame thing as well. But I had a memory come back of when I was really deep in the bulimia, my whole world was consumed by it. I can remember go to the shop to buy foods because I was going to binge and purge. And as I was walking into the shop, there was a homeless guy sat on the floor. And as I walked past him, he said, Miss, can you buy me a sandwich? And you know what it's like when you've got those blinkers on when you're going into binge? I did not want to engage. I didn't want anybody to acknowledge that I was walking into a shop. And I ignored this man. And I walked in thinking, oh my goodness. And I got into the shop. And I remember a moment of sort of paralysis. And then I stopped thinking. I went and got all my foods, walked back past the guy, ignoring him again. I remember getting in my front door and closing that door and being completely overwhelmed with shame. Like, I couldn't believe that I was doing this terrible thing, that there was somebody there who was hungry and wanted food, and I would have been in a position to buy someone a sandwich, and I was going in to buy an excess of food that I was going to eat and then throw up. And I remember going to therapy that week and just in therapy, like it all coming out, the worst person in the world, I was going to say a real pity party, but that sounds a bit judgmental. I'm not very compassionate to myself back then, but I was really in a big place with it. I don't remember exactly what my therapist said, but she was really stern with me and basically told me I was overreacting. And I remember at the time thinking, how can you not see what this awful thing is that I did? Because I was really expecting her to go like, yeah, that wasn't a great thing that you did there, but still being nice about it. But she wouldn't acknowledge that I'd done what I truly believed, and every moral fiber of myself and my values was this really awful thing that I did. That was the one I think that came up to me, because it was triggered by what I did. It took me to shame, but it was the guilt about, this is not right to what I'm doing here.
What was the offense in your estimation? Like, what was the true offense there?
The first word popped into my head was gluttony.
Okay.
You know, that it just seemed so morally wrong to be doing what I was doing, to have someone ask, someone who didn't have enough. It just felt like such ingratitude as well, I think, for, you know, my position. I've never had to go without food, and here I was struggling with excess when someone else was struggling with not enough, and I'd ignored him. I'd pretended he hadn't even existed.
Okay, those are two different things. Yeah, I think
it all just came together as one big.
How do you reframe it now?
Now I think I was in so much pain, and I was in so much confusion at that time. And I know what it's like when you're in that binge mode. Your higher thinking is switched off. You are not thinking. And there's also a slightly more judgmental part of me inside myself. It's like, at least you have the decency to feel really, really bad about it. So that somehow, you know, helps.
You have a conscience.
I paid some penance by being as distressed as I was, which is interesting. But the paying penance thing, I think, is a classic part of the binge cycle. It's that you binged, you feel really guilty. So now I'm going to make this plan for how I'm going to make up for it. And I think that's what guilt does. When maybe we have harmed someone or we've done something wrong, ideally guilt tells us that, and we have an opportunity to rectify or to make amends. But the problem is, when the thing you've done is wrong, is eat a lot of food, that rectification process in your mind is normally around, I have to eat less to make up for it. And then you're setting yourself up again, aren't you?
That's the crux of this conversation to me, is that, at least for binge eating and with the guilt around food, for me, so much of how I released that was understanding what your primal brain will do in a binge, and being able to separate this from your self and your higher brain and your conscious processing and your cognitive thinking. You know what I mean? Like, there's a part of your brain that houses your ability to separate right from wrong, and what you would prefer to do and what you would not prefer to do. And I used to just see all of that. I was so confused about the different parts of my brain, and assumed, like, if I'm doing this thing, for me, it was like stealing food from roommates, or even when I would babysit, that was like a time for me to be, that was a huge trigger for me. And the guilt I would feel, oh my gosh, I would feel like, who are you that you go to other people, this is not yours. I mean, I can't even really talk much more about it. It's just that I would carry that guilt all around. And for me in the recovery process, to understand what my brain was really doing, like, there was a part of me that it was animalistic. It was after something, was literally coming from a different part of me, of my brain. Like, it was, my higher brain wasn't giving me permission to do it. It was like fighting me the whole time. But this other piece that takes precedence over that higher thinking was at play, and it had been triggered. And for me to be able to understand how two different parts of my brain work was helpful for me to understand that, like, it wasn't that I was thinking it was okay and doing it anyway. It was just that I was operating under, like, more of an unconscious process of something pushing me towards food and propelling me towards food that my higher brain couldn't necessarily tap into. For me, that was a major force in alleviating some of the guilt about my behaviors with food and my obsession with it. I mean, it was a different process when I'm talking about, like, feeling guilt about eating certain kinds of foods and what foods I saw was bad and good, but the actual act of binge eating and the guilt about that, and understanding how that's differentiated between different parts of your brain, helped me feel less like a glutton, you know, like, which is essentially what I think it feels like. You're this selfish human being that you would choose to eat all this food and throw it up when there's people hungry right in front of you. We hope you're enjoying this episode of the podcast. We just want to take a minute of your time to let you know we're now on Patreon. If you would like to support our work and be a part of our growing community, please head to patreon.com/lifeafterdiets.
All of our patrons are invited to join us in our Life After Diets private Facebook group to connect with us and other like-minded souls. For more details about how to contact us or to work with Sarah or Steph individually, please check out the show notes. Now let's get back to the episode. How did you manage with the guilt when you were deciding in your recovery, when you made that decision, okay, I'm going to go all in and I'm going to give it a year? Was the act of giving yourself permission to do that enough to alleviate or manage the guilt? Or was there guilt that, residual guilt that kept coming up for you during that time? How did you manage that?
A lot of it was actually because when I was a black and white thinker. And so for me, it kind of like saying, if I'm giving myself permission, then I don't have to feel guilty. It was like very much, well, I've decided to do this thing, so there's no room for guilt now. So for me, it almost worked that way. It was kind of like, this is what I'm allowed to do. So for a year, it was kind of like suspend that guilt. It gave me permission to suspend the guilt, which is essentially, I think, what a lot of recovery was about. But I also did work to start to understand that I had such good and bad definitions of what food was. And it actually speaks to a post that you put up about the clean slate, right? Mm-hmm. So like for me, guilt came from messing up I'm thinking of like a blank piece of paper and just having any smudges on it at all. Like if there was one little smudge in the corner, I had to start with a new piece of paper. It was like that idea was guilt invoking for me. And so it was a lot about understanding that like one piece of a day that had gone awry, or like one type of food that I had eaten that wasn't on board with what I would consider healthy or supportive to my body, wasn't going to be like, I had to work on that clean slate syndrome and like understanding that that was not cause for guilt. And that was something that, again, was helped by giving myself permission to have a messy day. Like I went into my recovery saying my days are going to be pretty messy. Like it's going to look like that. And knowing that and giving myself permission for that in advance gave me also permission to say, well, then there's no reason to feel guilty here. It's only when you're holding on to an expectation of yourself that guilt starts to come in, like you've ruined it. Mm-hmm. But I kind of was like, I'm going to ruin it. I know I'm going to. I sort of understand this in advance. So that helped me a lot.
The permission part definitely seems to be extremely helpful at reducing guilt. If you can really give yourself permission. Sometimes I might ask someone if they're experiencing a lot of guilt, are they really giving themselves permission if they're continuing to believe that they're doing something wrong? But just going down a slightly different track with this, one post that I did a while ago that there was quite a big response to was that idea of feeling guilty about what you're doing to your body. Mm-hmm. So it can be all very well in your mind going, okay, I know that there's these two parts of my brain. I know that there are times when I lose control around food, but how can it not be enough? The threat of certain health consequences that might come from binge eating, even just that feeling bad, feeling physically unwell in your body over and over again. And people who have ended up with health diagnosis, which they believe or physicians are telling them is likely to be exacerbated by binge eating. Not talking about weight here, aside from weight, just binge eating and the potential impact that has on the body. Do you have any thoughts about reconciling that part of it? Or did it not feel that the physical effects of the binge eating was as pronounced for you?
During recovery or before it?
Start with before.
Yeah. So before it, the thing about my binges is that I never had a felt experience of degrading my body. Like I never had stomach issues or digestive issues or otherwise sensitivities where the eating itself would show up in an obvious way and make me think like, see, this is what it's doing to you, aside from gaining weight. So it was all cognitive. It was all this like, theoretically, I am damaging my body because I'm feeding it in mass, and there was guilt about that, but it was so wrapped up in the binge itself. It was like the act of mass consuming was more guilt inducing to me than what that food might have been doing to me. I think that I think that was like a side thought of I'm also degrading my body, but also I was younger, I guess, like in the beginning anyway. I think there was an invincibility that I had at the time that as I got older and when I got into my 30s and started having kids, it became more relevant, and where I was like, you're not, I was starting to just feel like I had to be more responsible for my body as I got older. And that's when I got into orthorexia. So my guilt did turn into, I did channel that into a way where it was like, I became absolutely obsessed with health and wellness and keeping, that was moral to me. And so then my binges became about those foods. Like I really did binge on like almond flour recipes and cauliflower. Like these were things I was binging on a lot of the time. And I think that was directly related to how strong the guilt was around the foods I was consuming and what they might be doing. I mean, that was a whole nother angle of my eating disorder.
Mm-hmm. I think it was something I carried a lot of guilt about when it came to my body, because I touched on before, I've got hormonal stuff. My pituitary gland doesn't work properly. So my hormones are already imbalanced. And there are so many compelling messages out there about how you can balance your hormones and support your hormone health through how you're eating. So I think there was an enormous amount of guilt for that I felt like, yes, okay, I had some physical medical problems that were not related to binging, yet I felt that I wasn't even trying to make it better for myself. And even that language is interesting because I was trying all the time. I just couldn't do it.
Yeah. But would it have mattered? I feel that when my healthism took over and I was like, all right, I'm going to treat my body well. I'm going to treat my body like a temple. I stopped having all sorts of things. And I did. And I think I did that, that was a direct result of trying to balance my hormones as well, because that was what I blamed. And neurotransmitters. I thought if I could eat this way, it would help me be a better person and a healthier person. And so I actually did. Only I would eat those types of foods. And still, my blood work was off. My binging continued. Like, to me, there was such a disconnect between these things are supposed to make me whole and healthy, and they're not. So after a while, it was like I began to really resent wellness because it was like not doing the things it had promised to do. So it's difficult, I think, if you are to address these things and your binge eating remains. Does that mean, I don't know, like, does it mean that they don't work? I guess there was for me a sense that like it doesn't matter anyway. Like eating these foods, it's just nonsense. Like it doesn't actually help me be healthier.
Mm-hmm. I think I blamed everything on the binge eating. So if my energy was low, it's because I'm binge eating. If this was off, it's because of how I was eating. And the example I would throw at myself, oh, but on a day when I'm eating really quote unquote well, I feel great. So therefore it must be the food. And it wasn't until quite far down the line when it occurred to me that maybe I eat a certain way when I'm already feeling better.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So if I'm having a day where I've got better energy, maybe I'm more drawn to foods that support that state compared to somehow the food is magically providing this for me. And I'm not saying that what I ate didn't impact my energy levels, but I think I'd put everything on that, because I suppose there's something as well with having a pretty big health condition that you can't fix, that food offers some hope. This healthism wellness thing offers some hope, alternative medicine, whatever you want to call it, because conventional medicine has taken me this far. Now it's on me to figure out the rest. And if this stuff works, then somehow I'm supposed to be in control of how I feel and my health.
Well, I think that's the crux of it. I think that to deny that nutrition plays a role in our energy levels and parts of our health would be remiss, but it's not a cure-all. Like I think that we just hang so much on it because it is a way of controlling things. And for me, this became about, I really swung that pendulum from being someone who binge ate on just non-nutritious foods to someone who binge ate on completely nutritious foods, and now live in a space of, I understand nutrition's role in supporting me and my body. And I like nutrition, but I don't think that it's going to make or break me. Over Christmas, I had holiday food that I don't normally have. And I think it did affect my energy levels to some degree at some point, but it was kind of like, okay, I'm not like damning myself to like hell for it. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, okay, like I feel low energy and I'd like to yeah, now I'd like some higher energy, and it was kind of like, okay, I'm going to add those foods back in, but neither one made me feel like I'm a bad person and now I'm a good person. It was just, this is what's happening to my body. I feel that after a while, and now I'm going to kind of move in this direction now. And it's not attached to who I think I am, which is where that certainly wasn't always the case. It was very much attached to who I thought I was. So I think that moralization of it and the identification with it, and I think ultimately what that is like us believing that food controls so much, is part of like the surrender of that power that food has, is part of how I believe I was able to move through food guilt. It was just suspending that was the entire thing here. To me, it became like my health is actually a lot more influenced by my stress and how I manage my stress and how I move, and also how I I sometimes feel like it's just about how I connect and how I honor my body's rhythms. That was what I was constantly denying in the pursuit of health and in nutrition. And now it's more like I'm paying a lot more attention to those things. So I don't have to put all my eggs in the nutrition basket. Like there's a lot of other things at play here for my health.
And to run with that a little further, I think it's worth mentioning the nuance between feeling guilty about something you've eaten or a food choice and regretting a choice. I absolutely have times where I might regret a decision that I made with food because of how I might feel afterwards, or maybe because I've ruined my dinner. That's an interesting black and white language there, but I've taken away some of the potential enjoyment of my dinner because I ate something earlier, whatever it might be. That for me, it feels different, regret and guilt. We talk about guilt as a burden, don't we? I think it's a very heavy emotion. And already at a time when we're feeling full of food, when we've got beliefs about our bodies being too big, add some guilt on top of that, and we're going to feel really uncomfortable in our bodies. But it being okay as well to sometimes make decisions and think, yeah, I wish I'd made another decision there. I wish I'd chosen not to have that, or to have something different, or to have more of that or less of that. And that can be it can just be information.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you've done something wrong. And this is moving away from perfectionism. That is what quote unquote normal eating is. It is sometimes making a food choice that afterwards you think, I would have liked to have made a different decision in hindsight from how I feel or what I know now.
Yeah. And part of that practice, I think, is a zooming out. When you were describing it, I was thinking of when more impulsive eating. Like sometimes if you eat something impulsively because something's convenient, it's there, it's quick, and you're like, that wasn't the best thing to support me, and I sort of maybe regret having done it that way. But it's like you zoom out on, you're like, where does it, when you zoom in on it, which is I think what you do is with perfectionism and anxiety, personally, I think like it's a zooming in effect. And it's like, everything is that. Everything was that decision. And everything is like, oh no. And when you zoom out and you're like, okay, can I see this in the context of the day and of the moment? And it happened, putting it in perspective rather than thinking this is the end all and be all of how you make decisions. Just look at this from a broader perspective. And also, I was going to ask, so if somebody is experiencing guilt about eating certain foods, or like when they have a certain food, it brings on guilt, or when they feel fullness, they feel guilty. What do you recommend, like as a way of dealing with that in the moment?
For me, there's something about capturing what the belief is around it. It may not even be, and this is the interesting thing with guilt and a lot of emotions, is that you experience the emotion first before you even know why you're feeling guilty about it. It just feels wrong. So in your mind, it's just wrong. I can still remember quite vividly, I think I've even mentioned this on the podcast before, but on one occasion where I'd had breakfast and I was walking to work and I felt really full. And I remember thinking, this actually feels quite nice to feel full. Like I hadn't had that experience before. There was something about, I had a new thought in that moment. I had a moment of appreciation. I'd really enjoyed my breakfast. I was full. And now I had all this energy that was just going to keep me going for the next few hours until it was going to be time to eat later on again. So recognizing, and it's capturing those judgments, because that's what the guilt comes from. It comes from this judgment that this thing is bad. I would want to direct people to our compassion episode, which I think might be an episode number 5, and I think is still one of my favorite episodes that we've done. This idea that compassion doesn't change anything. It does, because it cools those jets, those emotional jets. And when we cool down our emotional response, then we can see with more clarity and more perspective. So I think there's something, one, we have to recognize what that feeling is, because sometimes we might just feel bad and we don't even know why we feel bad. Let's name it. This is guilt. I feel guilty about this because I am believing, and then figure out what it is that you're believing. And when it comes to challenging beliefs, I think this is what our work probably is. That's what you and I do all the time with the stuff that we're creating and talking about, is this idea of there is another way to think about this. Mm-hmm. And so when people listen to these kinds of things and they absorb these messages, you will start to be able to find new beliefs and new possibilities. Because sometimes if someone doesn't suggest it to us, actually, maybe this is okay. You know, maybe what was your crime? You ate a lot of food. Is that really a crime? Yeah. Without somebody explicitly asking us, without my therapist saying to me, you're completely overreacting, I would have stayed in that story that I did the very, very worst thing that a human being could do. So that's what I was believing.
Well, yeah. So there's one piece where it's like, I that labeling, that's saying, this is what I'm thinking, believing, this is the reality. And can I reality check that? Or can I reframe that? Or is this true? Or even like, where did I learn that? But what about the chronic binging? Like I'm putting myself back there, and it's like, well, what about I binged again? Like I've done this again and again. It's like something that I feel like I deserve the guilt because I'm not learning. Or that's what I would have said. I would have said like, but this guilt is justified because I do it over and over and over again. And I don't want to be doing this. And yet I do. So I feel guilty because I am unable to help myself. I feel guilty because I'm unable to learn, or because I just constantly make mistakes. I mean, it becomes such a heavy burden to bear, of like, I like giving myself self-compassion, if I'm constantly just having to do that all the time. Like, where I feel like there would have been a part of me that's like, I need the guilt. I need the guilt to convince me that something needs to shift, because when I feel guilty enough, then I'll change something.
I think that's further than guilt, what you're describing. For me, in that there's shame, and shame blocks learning. I don't think you can learn from a place of shame. You can force yourself to comply behaviorally for a bit. It's not going to last. It's not going to stick. When you're saying like, I need this feeling because how will I learn without this feeling? Maybe this feeling is exactly what's stopping you from learning. So even recognizing that this feeling that I have is not serving me and maybe contributing to the problem, that realization isn't necessarily going to be enough for the feeling to vanish. But at least it takes this belief that you need the feeling. It disrupts that belief.
Yeah. I picture like, you know, when you do those mazes and you're trying to get out this way and you're like, keep coming into what's like, no, it's like, we're looking at it, this is the way. And it's like, actually, it's over there. Which is how, I mean, I've always experienced shame as a way of motivation, shame as something that helps me do something differently. And ultimately, you know, that belief for me has been so strong. I meet any other alternative with a lot of resistance, because it really feels compellingly true that if I just shame myself enough, I will change.
But it wasn't until doing this work that I realized there were people like you, Steph, who can use shame as a motivator for a while, because I never could. Like, to me, shame has always led to collapse. I just fold in on myself. I can't make myself take action from a place of shame. And so when I saw like other people could, that was when I thought, oh, maybe I just wasn't using shame correctly or something.
Yeah, that is interesting. I don't know. I don't know that it's using it successfully. It has changed my behaviors, and in some cases it was a catalyst for me being more introspective and changing some, but it wasn't the shame itself. It was almost like there's something else with it, because it can't just be shame, because I've done that too where it hasn't done anything, but there's something I think I learned to put with shame. I think curiosity too. Like when I was just shaming myself and being really rude to myself, that wasn't helpful. But when I would actually, when I would feel shame, and I guess going back to the beginning of this conversation, where I would feel shame and think, what else is here that's speaking to me? Like, what else, what's the deeper insecurity getting at? Then I would start to ask myself questions that got more to my true intention or my true desire to change, rather than the shame being why I wanted to change, or like the belief that I was bad. You know what I mean? It was kind of gotten a little deeper into it. So it's interesting because I guess I do sometimes use shame to get me to ask questions. But if you're not asking the questions, which I think is part of the self-compassion, then it doesn't, to me, that doesn't necessarily work long-term.
Mm-hmm. And I might just think of it more broadly as pain, because pain can be a pretty good motivator. If we're hurting a lot, we really don't want to hurt anymore. That can sometimes be a catalyst to get moving a bit. And I've definitely experienced that. But once the pain had reduced, then I would often just slip back to where I was. So it never felt, it really got me further forward.
We should talk more about this in our monthly call.
Yeah. We have this idea because we want to let people know that we're running monthly live events, and rather than recording a segment, we were saying, we'll just pepper it into the conversation somehow. And we've got to the end of the conversation.
There we are.
And forgotten to mention it. So here it is. Yeah, we're doing live events. Have a look below and see when the next one is.
We'll provide links.
And reviews. We need people to rate and review, please. I hate asking.
Yeah, the reviews is really helpful to getting the podcast out there for more people to find who need to find it. So we really would appreciate your reviews.
Yeah, I'm not sure Steph wanted me to mention this, but in the UK ones, nobody's written anything for about 10 weeks, which does not help us at all in the Apple podcast. Even if you just write a couple of words like nice ladies, worth a listen, that'll do. In fact, if you write that, I'll know that you heard it from this episode. Nice ladies, worth a listen.
Ladies.
Yeah, 3 stars. No, 5. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.